and there weren't any comments that were received back on those minutes, so I would present those for your approval if I can ask for a motion for that. Or do we need to do that, Jeff, since there were no comments? Phil?
Yeah, we can
move on. Okay.
Move on.
All right. So let me just take a second on protocol for comments during our meeting here today. The CAG representatives and official observers are when they're invited to comment. These are the kind of protocols that we would ask for. If possible, please activate your camera, but mute your microphone when you're during the entire discussion, unless you're called upon to speak. Please use that raised hand in the, I think it's usually in the right-hand corner of your screen on Zoom, to indicate that you have a comment, and wait for your name to be called. And once called, unmute your microphone and ask your question or provide your comment. Please remember to unmute your microphone. Once you've completed your comment or question, please deactivate that raised hand. So you hit the raised hand again, which seems not very intuitive to take it down. At the end of the discussion, we'll ask the PIOB observer, Shigeo Kashiwagi, to provide any closing comments in addition to his comments during the session as applicable. So let me take a second to introduce the presentation today. At the last joint CAG session was as I mentioned earlier, was in March, and that presentation was on audit policy in Europe. The topic for discussion today is the definition of listed entities and public interest entities, or PIEs. I'd like to introduce here in a minute and thank presenter Mike Ashley. He's the task force chair and an IESBA member. So as far as the PIE project is concerned, its background, at its December 2019 meeting, the IASBA unanimously approved the project proposal to revise the definitions of PIE and listed entity in the code. And this work is being undertaken in coordination with the IAASB in order to achieve convergence of the relevant concepts and terms used in the two board standards. And so we took two of the correspondent members from the IAASB, Fiona Campbell and Josephine Jackson, are involved in that task force. Although this topic was discussed at the March IASBA CAG meeting, this is the first time it will be considered during a joint CAG discussion. And with that, I'll pass it on to Mike for his presentation.
Thanks, Galen. Let me see if I can get the share screen to operate. Hopefully people can see that. Yes. Excellent. Okay. In which case, without further ado, if I can persuade it to move on to the next slide. So the objectives of this session are to discuss the issues that we've been discussing within the task force and with the IASBA board in particular, to provide some feedback. We had a first read of the proposed text at the last IASBA board meeting. That's the documents that you've been circulated with. We have started to think about some changes to that, which I'll try and indicate as we go through so that you've got a sense of the direction of travel. But really, I just wanted to go through, let's say, a little bit of a recap as to where we got to. I want to spend a bit of time on the overarching objective and the PIE definition as we've articulated it. Talk a little bit about what we're trying to do to determine local body capacity. Talk about the role of firms and obviously the transparency disclosure, where we are still working with the IAASB on how that will look at, and then pick up anything else at the end. So very quickly from the CAG recap that Galen indicated back in March, the IASBA CAG, generally supportive of the project and direction of travel. We got a few comments about the proposed high-level categories of PIE, questions about could we use the IFRS's public accountability entity definition, which is, I think, difficult. We had a question about public utilities, which again, I think is difficult on for a global code, but very much potentially something that could be included by national regulators depending upon the structure of their public utilities. A lot of comments and queries relating to the role of firms, which I hope we've addressed. Some concerns about the suggestion of changing the term from PI to SPI, so we abandoned that one. And obviously the PIOB reiterated how keen they are to ensure convergence and a common position between IASBA and IAASB on the PI definition to the extent that we can manage that. Since March, we've had a number of stakeholder discussions. We had obviously the IAASB meeting, we participated in that. There was an IFIR meeting. We've done a Forum of Firms meeting and a questionnaire, and we're following that up again with Forum of Firms. And we had the Joint National Standard Setters meeting, and we've had some meetings with member organisations of IFAC. And we also had the NAS exposure draft, where you may recall that there was a specific question raised within the NAS exposure draft about the direction of travel of this project, basically sharing views on what we might or might not pick up on it. We got 17 no comments. Of the comments we did get, 42 were basically supportive, 7 were not very supportive. I don't think there were, I would sum it up, there were no significant issues raised by the respondents that we have not already taken into account and discussed. The IAASB PI session, which was very helpful, so thank you for the opportunity from the IAASB to discuss that. I think there was general support for trying to share an overarching objective. There was not complete necessarily buy-in at this stage of the game. I think they wanted to reflect further on exactly how that objective was expressed, but nonetheless, an understanding that actually if we could achieve it, there would be advantages in that. There was support in principle, potentially for replacing within the IAASB standards listed entity with PI. But again, a need really consider that on a case-by-case basis to make sure that it worked in all cases. And that's important because we are, as you'll see later, proposing to get rid of the term listed entity from the IASBA standards. We're still talking about what we're going to replace it with, and it may not be PI, it may be a subset of PIs, but nonetheless, we are looking to get rid of the term listed entity. I think there was also general support for the proposed list that we had of PIs. Similar concerns that have been expressed by the IASBA board and others about the local body capacity to actually take what we have come up with as a high-level definition and refine that to fit local circumstances. And again, we've done some more work, which I'll talk about in a minute, about what we tried to do to at least mitigate that risk. There were some mixed views, I think it's fair to say, about what we were suggesting in terms of transparency about disclosure, because we were suggesting in the audit report that obviously would require a change to the ISAs. So that is a matter which I think is still requires discussion. Given that we are potentially, I suppose the best way of expressing it is muddying the waters a little bit about what is and is not a PI, because it will depend to some extent on local definitions. I'm still quite keen that somewhere or other people do have an understanding of whether something has been treated as a PI, and this strikes me as a place to put it, but we can obviously continue to discuss that area. Just to remind you how we'd done this, we wanted to set an overarching objective for additional requirements. A, to inform the approach that we took, B, to test the proposals against that, and when approved, to inform how local bodies and firms would then apply it. And in essence, the way we've tried to articulate the overarching objective is there are certain entities where there is significant public interest in their financial condition. Therefore, the public confidence in those financial statements is important. Confidence in their audits will in turn enhance public confidence in those financial statements. And these requirements will enhance confidence in those audits. And then it flows back up the chain. So that, if you like, was how we tried to articulate what the purpose of all this was, on the basis of coming up with a PI definition just for the sake of coming up with a PI definition is not very valuable unless you know what you're intending to do. So I think it's fair to say that IAASB, in its June meeting, had general support. There were some queries about should we be doing something about ESG reporting requirements, which I think there's a general sense that the answer to that is no, not at this stage, because that is still an evolving science in of itself and doesn't directly impact on the financial statements at the moment. It's a separate piece of reporting. There were questions about market operators and stock and commodity exchanges, entities subject to financial and prudential regulation, and questioning about a proposed factor relating to systemic. So some of those we dealt with, some of them we have taken a very conscious decision that we are not going to specifically address. At the IAASB meeting, as I said, there was general support for a common overarching objective, in principle support for potentially replacing listed entity, and queries about what not want, so when I say queries, I suppose not wanting to give a perception there are two tiers of audit quality, which was not what we were trying to do. Some question about what was meant by financial condition. We've kept that phrase because we do think it is reasonably clear in the context in which we're expressing it. And some question about whether the IAASB might need some minor differences in how they express that objective. Hopefully, we have tried to address. I was questioned at the IAASB board, particularly on this overarching objective, that there was no direct reference to independence. My rationale for that was to say, well, I hoped if I didn't refer to independence, it would increase the odds of the IAASB also supporting actually adopting the overarching objective, because it wasn't tied to independence, it was tied to improving confidence in audits generally. And there are several aspects of that, some of which are firmly within the IAASB's remit. So in terms of what we have done since we had the conversation with the IAASB, and which we presented to the IAASB board, we have, as I said, retained the term financial condition. We haven't made any changes re ESG. In terms of financial and prudential regulatory supervision, we have included a bullet in that, which I'm not sure will pick up a great deal that isn't picked up by the first bullet, but I think does make it very clear that it is one of the aspects we'd be looking at. And we were very keen, again, because we're trying to tie this all back into financial statements, to indicate that the purpose of the regulatory supervision should be designed to provide confidence in the entity meeting its financial obligations, because obviously you can have regulation for all sorts of purposes, which may have nothing to do either with the financial statements or the work of the auditor. We also tried to, in bullet 4, we've picked up this concept of whether something is easily replaceable in the event of financial failure. So I think that does address, in some markets, public utility companies, for example. In some, they are very easy. I mean, the UK, for example, I think I've been through 2 electricity suppliers in the last 3 years, because the market is fiercely competitive. They all try and undercut each other, and as a consequence, they go bust with regularity, but then it just gets passed on to the next supplier, because they are merely acting as a conduit, if you like, between the electricity generator and the end customer. So replacing them is very easy. So they're not really public interest entities in that sense. And we have retained bullet 6 as a factor for consideration in terms of the systemic impact. Sorry, move on. In 400.9, we removed the term additional, which was partly to try and not to give the impression, if you like, there were 2 tiers of audit quality. So we felt it was helpful just to say the purpose of these requirements and application material. We didn't feel, however, that there were any other changes needed to reflect differences in how the overarching objectives should be expressed in the 2 board standards, although we would welcome the IAASB's comments on that the next time they have a chance to consider this. And we are also obviously going to be liaising with the IAASB representatives on replacing the term PI. And at that stage, I was just going to pause and ask for views from CAG members about both the overarching objective and the proposed paragraphs 400.8 and 400.9.
I'd like to invite the CAG representatives and observers to please log in on this. Either if you agree or you have additional comments, please provide those with your raising of their hand.
Galen, if I may just add, Stavros has joined us now. Stavros, welcome.
Okay. Any comments on this?
Stavros, you're on mute, just in case you were making some comments.
I was just saying hello to everybody and apologizing for my delay in joining. Couldn't get the connection. Please go on.
Thank you, Stavros. I see Paul Thompson has a comment.
Thank you, Galen. Just a simple statement of support for the proposals.
Thank you, Paul.
I'll certainly bank that one.
Might I say, Michael, on this notion of public utilities, which I raised early in the process, I agree with where you've gone with that. I've kind of come full circle. I think many of the larger utilities, and I really can only speak to the country that I'm from, but they tend to be publicly held in most cases, and the ones that are not publicly held tend to be pretty small, and therefore I think more likely to be replaced if there were some sort of financial issue. So I have to say that I would support where you've gone with this. I don't see any other. Oh, Don, if you wanted to weigh in. Don McGreeshy, are you on mute?
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to unmute. Yeah, just a quick one for me. The SMP AG likewise supports it.
Thank you, Don. And Naomi Robert?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I just would like to echo our support for this overarching objective as well. If you could just go back to the paragraphs we are just discussing with the R400.8, where I think we refer to the size of the entity.
Mike, are you able to move the slides?
It's page 12, right?
Yeah.
11. There you are.
Yes, we refer to the factor, one of the factors being the size of the entity, and I was just wondering if this was a good factor at international level. But otherwise, overly supportive of these objectives.
I mean, if I just respond to that very quickly, I mean, I think as we try to indicate later, size will clearly be dictated to some extent by the market in which people are operating. So we might expect local regulators to take a different view on where they have cutoffs, for example. So to that extent, I think it's a factor at a global level, but I would hesitate to just say where I would draw lines.
Thank you, Naomi and Mike. So Jim Dowkin has a comment.
Thank you, and Mike, I think from my perspective, I support the direction where this is going, particularly for something like the public utilities. I don't think you can draw the bright lines. So I think having the parameters that you have in here are more effective than including a certain industry group or not. So I like where this is headed.
Conchita?
I support the what has been presented. from the point of view of the representation of the organization I am with. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. I don't see any other hands, Mike. So you wanted to move forward?
Okay. So following on from that, you may recall we looked at the basic approach that we would adopt if you take that overarching objective and said we would look at a broad approach, which was a somewhat longer and more broadly defined list than we have had historically, but which we would fully anticipate local regulators and authorities would modify by tightening definitions, potentially setting size criteria, and potentially adding or exempting particular types of entities. And the example I always give there, and if you look particularly, for example, at the EU directives, whilst credit institutions as a generality are included, then small credit unions are deliberately excluded. So it's that sort of nuance that I think is almost impossible to define at a global level and requires local authorities to determine what is appropriate, taking into account the various public policy aspects within their jurisdiction. So the role of the code, we said, would be to set a list of common PI categories. We would expect local bodies to refine that list as appropriate. And lastly, we did think that it was appropriate for the firm to have a role to determine whether there were some particular circumstances which actually they ought to be adding to the list. So you may recall that our starting point for our list of PI categories was this. So it had basically 5 categories plus the sweep all at the end, which is any entity which a law or regulation actually specified was PI. I think fair to say both boards were supportive of the rationale we had for developing that list, which was effectively to include categories that we thought were likely to be adopted by most jurisdictions, but not to include categories that would only be included, if you like, by a minority. We included categories if the criteria for excluding them would be largely because they were very small. Equally, however, we have not attempted to include categories that would only be included just because they happen to be very large. And the typical example there is, for example, in the UK, they have recently decided that they wish to include some of the very large privately owned companies within the category of PI. That is because they play a particular role within the UK marketplace and UK employment, and therefore that is the view that has been taken in that country. I'm not sure how many other countries would want to adopt that, but we have clearly not included in here large private entities as a category within here, because to say if the criteria is really only that they are very large, I think it's almost impossible to make that workable in a global context. In terms of some of the comments that we got, we had some comments about whether we're being slightly archaic in talking about shares, stock and debts, and we have modified that slightly. In the process of being publicly traded, we had some views about whether or not we should try and capture things that was, if you like, moving towards a listing or moving towards some sort of public trading. In terms of category D, there was a question whether the language is too broad. We've tried to address that because we have said it's the function of the entities to provide post-employment benefits. So it's not just one of their functions. So in other words, this is not designed to capture employers. This is designed to capture pension schemes or post-retirement benefit schemes of one sort or another. And category F, we did have some queries about whether it's necessary or appropriate, but I think in the overall context that this is how we expect most of it to be defined ultimately. I have no concerns about including it. Where we have taken this since then is we've talked about now equity or debt instruments, which, if you like, more closely aligns with the sort of language you would find in IFRSs. And I think captures the essence of what it is we're trying to do here. As I said, we haven't changed post-employment benefits. We've come up with an even uglier description, which I claim full responsibility for for what we actually mean by open-ended mutual funds. If somebody's got we have given some thought to that, and I think we've got a slightly better one now, but if anyone's got pearls of wisdom to cast in this particular direction about how do you define a mutual fund, which is called a unit trust in some places, mutual funds in other places, we tried to avoid using, if you like, particular country descriptions. So that's why we ended up with that. And we have also in 400.16, there was a slight concern about just because something is defined as a public interest entity, does that mean it's a public interest entity for the purposes that we are trying to achieve? So we have tried to address that in terms of what we have marked up in terms of 400.16. And you may recall we did basically say we didn't care what it was called. If it was designed to meet the objective, then that made it a pie for our purposes. We've now included the reverse of that test, so to speak. So we have said, if something has been designated as, quotes, a public interest entity, but it's for reasons which are unrelated to our objective, that doesn't mean that such entities are public interest entities for the purposes of the code. So we've tried to make that evenly balanced. We did consider a lot of other potential additions. We considered some in June. We were asked to consider 2 more for our latest meeting, neither of which we recommended adding, because again, you have the issues that it doesn't work terribly well at a global level. Again, the structure of stock and commodity exchanges varies around the world. Quite a lot are publicly owned these days. Some aren't, but where they aren't, some of them are mutuals. Some of them produce accounts, some of them produce audited accounts, some don't. So all in all, it's quite difficult. Similar thing with audit firms. Again, not all audit firms are organized within a structure that actually even requires them to produce accounts, let alone audited accounts for public consumption. So on the whole, we've decided that those together with the previous categories we considered, those are the sorts of ones that we think are more importantly left to national regulators and national standard setters to consider.
Mike, might I interject? What is FMI? What are you talking about there?
Financial market intermediary. And apologies for the acronym.
Thank you.
And again, I will just pause there and just see if there are any comments.
Yeah, before we do that, Hussein tried to raise his hand on the last pause. He was having a problem with that. Hussein, did you have anything that you wanted to add on that earlier section?
Thank you very much. Sorry for technical problem. First of all, thank you for the presentation. My concern is about when we look at the paragraph 14.8, it's say that reflecting significant public interest in financial condition. Financial condition, I just was wondering, this financial condition also capture business activities. I think for some kind of public interest entities, business activities more important than financial situation, financial to public. Therefore, I think here it may be useful to state both financial condition and business activities of these entities, significant public interest. Statement may be revised like that. Thank you.
Okay, if I can just respond to that very quickly. I mean, we have tried to make it clear this is all to do with public interest in financial statements and the role of the auditor. Since the auditor doesn't generally opine upon the business activities of a client, that's why we would hesitate to include it, because we're not sure that it then fits with what we are trying to achieve here. There may well be public interest in business activities, but we don't feel that the public interest in those business activities makes it something which requires separate independence or audit quality control requirements to enhance confidence in the audit.
Thank you.
We okay with that, Hussein? Yeah, okay. So let's move back then into this section that was just covered. Hassan, Sela? has a comment.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Mike, for the presentation. With regarding to this question, we as EFAA, of course, agree with the expanded list of classification of public interest entities. But my concern is about the point F, which is an entity specified as such by law or regulation. Of course, when it comes to the other points, when it comes to 416, is clearly stated that, however, if law or regulation designates entities as PI for reason unrelated to the objective set in paragraph 400.9, that designation does not mean that such entities are public interest entities for the purpose of the code. I am concerned because, of course, for example, in our jurisdiction, the government has decided to extend, without taking into consideration all the requirements, why those entities should be public interest entities. And in some cases, this is done for some other than code purpose. For example, how to increase the financial means of the Public Oversight Board. And I wanted that point, from that point of view, to be much more clear. And in case that there is any, how to say, idea rather than the objective for this classification, not to be considered when it comes to auditing financial statements based on ISAs. Thank you.
Michael, did you want to respond now or later?
Well, I suppose, do you feel that we need to go further than we have tried to do in 400.16A1?
Yes, just to be much more stronger in what we are saying there, because it seems that things will be misunderstood and will create some difficulties. Okay, if it is possible.
If you've got any suggested wording to put in 416.A1, we'd happily consider it.
Thank you, Heisen. Meng, did you, Meng Wei?
Yes. Hello, Galen.
Yes.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Oh, hello. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for the work has been done. Thanks for the presentation. I support the direction the task force is working on, but I would like to express my concern about the factor A in 414. In this factor, traded is used instead of listed. Generally speaking, if a security is listed but not public traded, it still has public investors. And if the security was traded in last several years, but no trading in the reporting period, whether it should be traded as PI. In my view, it will need more judgment when you use the word traded instead of listed. It sometimes may cause some confusion when applied this. That's all, thank you.
Okay. I mean, we did deliberately choose that, not least because there are a number of jurisdictions, and mine is one of them, where there are things which are listed as a matter of convenience because you get a different tax treatment, for example. So what tends to happen is subsidiaries will list debt, which is wholly owned within the group. And actually making those subsidiaries PIs in of themselves doesn't make any sense because that debt is not owned by the public. So you can have things which are listed which do not issue shares to the public. So we've deliberately had some element of public trading. I think if you've got a stock which does not trade at all, that would beg a question as to why it was having a listing and why therefore it would make it of public interest. Because generally speaking, if you've got the public owning shares, the only way they can access the some of the benefits of that is by trading them. And if there's absolutely no trading at all, you have to question, is it really public ownership? So I agree there may be an element of judgment there. I'm not sure we want to go back to listed because I think that's got more problems than publicly traded.
Naomi Robert.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So I would like to comment on the point 16 paragraph, where I think that if we read a firm may determine not to treat an entity as a public interest entity when in accordance with law or regulation, and then we go to see that entity is specified not to be a public interest entity. I would think that there is a more elegant or maybe a less circular way of saying that we are talking about maybe two different things, two different public interest entity concepts. So there may be a way to specify that we are talking about, so public interest entity in the code or in ISAs, if we think for the future, should be solely for the purpose of applying the relevant provisions of the standards, and that should not be contradicting to the local law and regulation in a way. So then it means that for paragraph 14, the little f, where we have specified in national law and regulation, should be dropped. So I'm just thinking that we may not be as clear as possible. So this is a bit linked to what Aysen was mentioning before. But I just wanted to draw your attention to this fact that if you read paragraph 16 with little c, it's I'm not so sure it's understandable.
Okay. Well, as I say, we will look at that, but I'm very happy to take suggestions on wording. I think we're aligned on what it is we're trying to achieve. It's just the best way of achieving it.
Paul Munter.
Thanks, Galen. Mike, thanks for the presentation. I was just curious about the thinking, this on slide 18, where one of the categories you decided not to consider is custodians. So I was thinking about brokers, trusts, things like that. And I was curious as to what the reasoning was. For example, maybe the reasoning is that a lot of those are already captured by financial market intermediaries, or was there some other thought process behind not considering custodial entities?
It comes back to the overriding objective, which is interest in the financial statements of the entity that is being audited. And in a lot of cases, the financial statements of a custodian tells you nothing about their custodial activities. Does in some, doesn't in quite a lot. And quite often there is separate reporting designed to give comfort to those either corporates or members of the public that those custodians are fulfilling their custodial responsibilities, but that does tend to be separate reporting rather than financial statement audits. So that was the rationale. Now, as I say, it may be that in some countries and given some structures, so broker-dealers in the US, where there is more of a mingling, if I can put it that way, between their on-balance sheet and off-balance sheet activity, as I'm very conscious they are effectively all captured within the broker-dealer rule, and therefore tend to get treated as quotes pies, although that term isn't used. In some countries that may work, in a lot of countries it doesn't. If you take the UK, there's very distinct reporting on custodial activities, which is separate from the audit. Doesn't even need to be carried out by the auditor, although quite often is.
I see Hussein Yurdakal has his hand up. Hussein.
Thank you. I actually have two issues. One is about entity definition. An entity was debt or equity instrument. I think for covering almost all instruments, maybe publicly traded, this should be better to use securities. I am not sure this debt or equity instrument whether cover for example, derivative instrument, or in Islamic finance, there may be some instrument traded in exchange. It's not debt or not equity. Therefore, for covering almost all securities can be publicly traded, this definition should be an entity was securities or financial instrument like that is better than. I think you should consider this option. My second issue is about financial market infrastructure entities. As all of us know, for capital market, these entities have important roles for investor, facilitating investor to buy or sell securities, and therefore I think there is a public interest on these entities. Therefore, it should be better to put here, for example, for intermediaries or broker or dealer, investor open an account and trade some securities. For investor, these entities, therefore, for investor, these entities, financial condition, business activities, I think are important. Thank you.
I mean, I would hope that it would be captured within either of the first two bullets that we mentioned. It won't be captured by all, but again, if I can just give an example of a financial intermediary, there is an entity in the UK which controls all of the payment systems in the UK. I can assure you there is absolutely no interest in its financial statements, because if you read its financial statements, you conclude it was bust. And the only reason that nobody's bothered about it is basically owned by all of the banks and supported by the Bank of England, and everyone knows that actually there's a lot of things behind it, if you like, that will ensure that the payment system keeps operating. But its financial statements are of little or no interest, and certainly not of public interest.
Yes, you are right. For some entities, there is no public
Which is why
interest,
we've tried not to do it globally. If in that, there's nothing to stop a national regulator where it's got financial intermediaries in that country which fulfill a role, which means that they need to have that, there needs to be public confidence in its financial statements, including it. What we've said is it's not something that we would wish to try and deal with globally, because you would capture an awful lot of things in which, frankly, there was no public interest in the financial statements.
So this would be a case where you're looking to the local regulator to really scope in or out that.
Correct.
Is that what you're saying?
It's back to our 80-20 rule. We've tried to include things which we've looked around the globe to see what national standard setters have included, and we've included lots, the things they've tended to include, basically. We've not tried to capture the universe because, as I say, I think you'd end up with a lot of exclusions, and we didn't want to encourage local regulators to start excluding things en masse.
Thank you. So Don, you have the floor. Don Magishi.
Thank you, Galen. Yes, the SMP agrees with the proposed list of the PI categories precisely for the reason that Michael has just pointed out, that it just becomes so complicated when you're dealing with different jurisdictions, and those PAOs know what's important in their jurisdiction and what should be scoped in and out. So I think it's the best option you have in the circumstance.
Thank you, Don. And Paul Sobel.
Yeah, so first of all, let me commend the task force on doing really a splendid job getting to this point. It's really a challenge, I appreciate, to walk that fine line between trying to be very precise with language while also remaining broad where necessary. Toward that end, as it relates to the PI categories, so it's back on slide 15. I don't know if it's necessary to go back there or not, but B and C use the word main, referred to whose main functions where D, E, and F do not. Now, I suspect the task force was very thoughtful in deciding when to use the word main or not. I wasn't sure whether main meant more than 50% or exactly how you would define it in that context of B and C versus how it might be interpreted by its absence in D, E, and F.
It was very deliberate, and we've deliberately not tried to draw bright lines as to, does it mean more than 50%? And we've said one of whose main, because clearly if you take just something like a bank, it has several functions, one of which is to take deposits from the public, but the other one of which is to lend money and do foreign exchange and do everything else that it wants to do. So we're not trying to be prescriptive, if you like, about how much of its activity should, how you should measure, if you like, main. I suppose we're leaving that a little bit to good judgment. And you're right, it was very deliberate. I'm also conscious I didn't respond to Hussein's comment. We've sort of toyed with securities versus financial interest, etc. It's still not a completely closed debate. Nobody has yet managed to tell me, though, what I would include if I included securities that I wouldn't include if I include financial interest. So again, if you have examples of what would be captured by one rather than the other, we're more than happy to look at it. But I haven't had a good explanation as yet as to what would be included that we're currently excluding.
Conchita. Conchita, the floor is yours. If you had a comment, or was that from the last? Use your hand still up.
I appreciate the work done by the task force, but I would like to compliment the earlier comment of Meng Wei. Just to say that item A, an entity whose shares, stocks, or debts are publicly traded. I'd like to further the explanation by saying, when a listed company decided to delist, there is supposed to be some provisions in some jurisdictions that tender offers may be made to small investors. But oftentimes those investors, or the majority of them, do not take on the tender offer due probably to the time limit or whatever, or availability of the information on a timely manner. So in effect, there is a continuing obligation to what used to be the public referred to when it was listed. But once delisted, what will happen to them? I know it's very difficult to make the categories all-inclusive, but just a thought to complement what Meng Wei said. And indeed, it happens that listed companies may delist, and therefore they may not be included here. But there is still continuing public investment in that delisted entity. Often enough, they are referred to collectively as minority interest. Now, how do we take care of the minority interest? And I compliment the inclusion of entities specified as such by the law or regulation of the particular jurisdiction. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. We have one more person, Daniel Pavas, as a comment. And Daniel, if you can try to make it brief so that we can move on.
Sorry, I couldn't turn my microphone on. It's just a little comment. I see that this project focuses on the general characteristics of a pie, making it very similar to those set out by the IASB. However, I don't know, I think the paragraph 14F seems very brief to me. I say that because of the situation and special situation in Latin America, where we are undeveloped countries. So I think that depending on the general characteristics of a pie, there should be a little more elements, I think, to decide in a country whether certain types of entities, considering local circumstances, could be classified as pie, because the paragraph doesn't say anything, doesn't give any clue about that. That's my comment.
Thank you, Daniel. Michael, that's the last comment. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, I suppose just coming to the listing, delisting, I mean, clearly under the extant code, if something delists, it stops being treated as a pie, potentially. The view we took was that similarly, if it ceases to, the securities cease to be publicly traded, and I would emphasize that we're talking about publicly traded, not traded by the public. So in other words, it does imply that there is some mechanism, doesn't need to be a stock exchange mechanism, but there is some mechanism for facilitating trade between shareholders or between shareholders and other members of the public. So an example would be, as I think they're called pink sheets in the US, where that facility is made available by a broker or some other sponsor, but it is not as far as a listing. We do think those are pies. If you have a company where clearly shareholders may choose to sell their shares and they sell them privately, if I can put it like that, in the sense that they got to go out and find a buyer, there isn't a facilitated marketplace for them, those we're saying we would not treat as pies. But if they are publicly traded, there is some public trading venue or avenue open to them, then that's what we would do. And similarly, if something then delists in the example that was given, it would depend upon, if you like, what facility was made available to those minorities to continue to trade their shares, as to whether we would now capture it or not. In terms of law and regulation, I think we've indicated we will look at that, but clearly local regulators at the end of the day can designate anything as a pie and apply these regulations if they wish to do so. That's entirely within their control. What we're trying to do is point people in directions. But I understand the concern.
Thank you, Michael. And I think we probably need to move along at this point.
Okay. So it goes without saying, we've already covered a bit of this. The expected role of local bodies, we do expect them to refine it as appropriate because of the high level nature of the categories we've set out. And otherwise we might inadvertently scope in the wrong entities, or in fact, not scope in others where it is appropriate. The concern that has been expressed is whether or not local bodies have the capacity to do that. We're looking to mitigate that concern, I suppose. We are looking to develop quite a lot of guidance around what is the intention here in terms of the overarching objective, and some non-authoritative guidance material which we think will be useful for both national regulators and indeed for firms when considering whether to treat things as pies or not. We are anticipating we'll have quite a long transition period before this becomes effective. And we have, as I indicated earlier, done a questionnaire to PAOs in terms of understanding not just their own ability in those jurisdictions where they have the control of the pen, so to speak, but also their view on other regulators. We circulated that to about 40 PAOs in July, August. It was mostly smaller and less developed jurisdictions. We've had, it says there, 22 responses back to date. We're also having now found somebody to translate our questionnaire into French. That seems to take an inordinate length of time, but we have now done that, and we've sent that off to, apologies, I'm clicking on things and it's, and therefore we will get that back hopefully in Q4. In terms of the picture we've had so far, it's been pretty good, and a strong indication that they will be able to do something. One PAO in particular noted they would require some substantial work to persuade the local regulator to revise the local law, but that's 1 out of the 40. Everywhere else, I think, was pretty comfortable. Quite a number also said they have local PI definitions. Whether they are wholly appropriate for what we are trying to achieve is maybe questionable, but they do at least have something. And we are hopeful that, as I say, if we develop some guidance, that actually this is not so much of a problem as might have been concerned. We did, as an alternative to this whole approach, we did discuss with the IAASB board at the last meeting whether we could use a rebuttable presumption. And we looked particularly, I mean, South African code has a rebuttable presumption component to it, but the IAASB board did not support it. And I have to say I'm probably with the IAASB board on this one, because I think it does lead to more questions than it answers. So we have decided not to go down that road. Again, just interested in any views that CAG members might have in terms of local body capacity.
So at that point, we'd ask any comments on what Mike just covered. And I see Takeshi from Japan has a comment. Takeshi, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Galen, and thank you, Mike, for the presentation. And hearing the presentation and also the discussion, the previous part, I'm a little confused the relation between the law of IAASB code and the law of each jurisdiction local bodies. For example, in the case that one local body, national standard setter, define their own definition of the PI, they define, for example, listed entity or banks and insurance companies, such kind of companies defined as a public interest entities. These entities are same as from small a to small c in the paragraph 400.14. But the local body does not include it in their own definition, the rest of entity in the paragraph R400. For example, small d or small e, such kind of company, they does not include it their definition. So in that case, the firm should treat it entities falling in small d or small e in paragraph 400, such kind of entities as a PI according to the paragraph 400.14. And also the paragraph R400.15 states that the firm shall have regarded to the law or regulation which provide more explicit definition of categories. So in this case, the local body does not include it, small d or small e, nothing referring to these categories. In another words, local law or regulation only stated listed entities. For example, banks or insurance companies, such kind of companies is a PI, but they does not state clearly that other than entities are not treated as a PI. So is it okay to consider that in this case, the local law or regulation provide more explicit definition? This makes me a little confused because paragraph R416 also mentions small c. This point already mentioned by Naomi, but paragraph 400.16 small c states that firm may determine not to treat the entity as a public interest entities when the law or regulation that entity is specified not to be a PI. So firm can apply this paragraph to this case. So therefore the firm can decide not to treat the entity falling in the small d or small e as a PI according to the paragraph R 400.16, because these entities are not mentioned in the local law or regulation. I little confused the relationship that the code and the law of each jurisdiction. My understanding, my view is, I believe it is good to each local bodies can delete the listed item in paragraph 400.14 from B to if, so that each set has appropriate the PI in its local SQL standard, considering the IAASB code. And also in addition, it might be also good that more strict description in the code. For example, the local body is able to delete the entity listed in the paragraph 400.14 if they have a reasonable ground. I believe such kind of the description would be useful to avoid confusion. So I listened to the conversation, and also when I listened to your presentation with regard to the role of the local body, I become a little confused. So thank you.
If I respond briefly to that, I think there's a distinction I would draw between, if you like, a clear determination by a local regulator that something should not be included as a matter of public interest, and the fact they haven't got around to including something. If it's in the latter case, that's one reason why I think it's quite important, and we'll come on to that in a second, for the firms to have a role in determining what should be treated as a PI. Because in the event that a regulator is just silent on the subject, I think the firm, taking into account the criteria that we specified, will have a requirement to determine if something is a PI. Clearly, if a regulator has determined for matters of public policy or whatever else that something should not be treated as a PI, which is really what 416 says, then it should not be up to the firm to say, I don't care what the local regulator thinks, I'm going to make it a PI anyway. That would be, if you like, contrary to the public policy of that jurisdiction. I don't know if that helps, and it's not entirely clear cut, because I don't think you can have it entirely clear cut, but that is in essence what we are trying to achieve here. And obviously in the guidance material that we will have developed before the December IAASB board meeting, then we would hope to expand on that a bit. We did think about the point you raised about making it clear that local regulators should exclude. Frankly, we don't want to encourage them to just go around excluding everything. And we thought refine encompasses exclude. It's a slightly extreme version of refine, but it does get included.
We have a couple other comments, Hyson, Sella, and then followed by Paul Thompson. And if you can try to make your comment brief, thank you.
Okay. Of course, with this kind of discussion, with regarding to the role of the local body, it's important to say that the local body has much more, let us say, expertise than representative of the regulators in some jurisdictions. So from that point of view, I think they are able, with this kind of mitigation strategy, to help in refining the high level of PI. But this has to be combined. I am, how to say, in doubt regarding for what purpose will be the role of the local body. For example, the code of ethics is to be adopted as it is, or is going to be, how to say, under the jurisdiction with some changings. And the local body, of course, will take into consideration all the classification points, but the main role is to help not to include, as in point F, too many, let us say, or to exclude some of the PI that will be in some jurisdictions. And from that point of view, I think that with this mitigation strategy, and of course with developing non-authoritative guidance materials, this will help professional body to play the key role in this process. But I totally agree, if there is not, how to say, direct intervention in case of adopting the code as it is, then there will be no role from the professional body. Thank you.
Paul, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I just have some few concerns about as to which professional accountancy organizations receive the questionnaire, not least because I think in Europe, there seems to be very few respondents. I think I read one. I'm just curious as to whether or not we've reached out to, for example, the EU Eastern Partnership countries, and also some of the other countries in and around Central Asia and the former Soviet Socialist republics. That's all.
Michael, those are all the comments we had. Did you have any final response on any of those?
No, I mean, it was a slightly targeted thing in terms of aiming it more or less developed. So we did not, I think, largely cover EU because they've clearly gone a long way down a PI definition, and indeed member states within the EU have adopted various PI definitions underneath that. But certainly if there are countries that you would have concerns over, very happy if you want to drop Jeff a note and we can consider reaching out to those and thinking about those further. I don't think we can cover every country in the world, is the only thing I would caution against. Okay, if I move on then. As I think you're aware, we have elevated what was application material before that encouraged the firms to think about adding in things for PIs. We've now made that a requirement, which we think fits with the overall model. So they are required to determine if there are additional entities to be treated as PIs, and we have given a list of additional factors for firm consideration. There was general support from stakeholders about that. One of the questions that you may recall did get raised, and I think it got raised by both boards, in terms of if something was on the cusp of becoming a PI, should that be a factor that actually means it should be included? We decided that was far too difficult in terms of making it a strict criteria, but it is something that the firms can take into account because they're likely to be much more knowledgeable about the particular facts and circumstances in an individual case. So we have included that as a factor. And in terms of things which came out of the IAASB board last time around, one of those was thinking about, well, if something has been treated as a PI in the past and the circumstances haven't changed, why would it not continue to be treated as a PI? Again, it's not authoritative. It doesn't require treatment as a PI, but we do think it is a criteria that the firm should take into account and think about. The last bit we've got in terms of the role of the firms is obviously this question about transparency disclosure, and suffice it to say, I think we are still in discussion with the IAASB about that. I'm still quite keen that we try and get there if we can. I think the IAASB meeting next time round is going to be presented by three options, which vary from the don't do anything to change something and bits in between. So we'll obviously see how that discussion goes. But it would be interesting to see where that ends up. Again, I'll just pause very briefly for any comments on the additional factors and any comments about disclosure or otherwise in the audit report and the options that that have been put together for IAASB's consideration.
Michael, I'll weigh in on this one. I'll take privilege of doing that. So, I mean, historically, auditors have reported on a true and fair value, or however you want to phrase that, depending on your jurisdiction, on financial condition and results of operation. And so it seems now that we're stepping up that to add a third category, and then that would be whether the entity deserves to be treated as a public interest entity. So it seems implicitly or explicitly there's that additional conclusion. So that's a pretty important step, I believe, for the profession.
I suppose I'd describe it slightly differently. We're not asking them to opine on whether it should be. We're asking them to say simply whether it has or has not.
Okay.
Just so that people are then aware, well, if it has, then we can presume that these requirements that the code sets out for what you have to do in those circumstances, either in the IAASB code or in the IAASB code, hopefully, that those provisions will have been applied. That's all we're trying to indicate to a reader of the accounts. They know, if you like, what regime has been applied in terms of conducting that audit and meeting the independence requirements.
Okay, so we're not opining on the existence of a PI. We're just telling the public how we've treated the entity.
Correct.
Yeah. Any
just
other
so
comments?
just so there's no confusion about, as I say, which set of requirements have been followed.
All right. Any others? I don't see any hands here, Mike. So if you wanted to, oh, Takeshi just raised his hand. So Takeshi.
Oh, thank you. I have just quick question. I heard your presentation, Mike. For fee project, fee related information that maybe my understanding is the current proposal, the firm has a flexibility to disclose fee related information. For example, their audit report or annual report by the audit firm or such kind of other area where they're thinking appropriate place. So with regard to this transparency, the audit client is PI or not PI, why such kind of information task force proposed disclosing the audit reports compared than the fee related information? Just a quick question from my side. Thank you.
I think that this was regarded as much more a matter of how the auditor has treated the client. So in other words, it's much more firmly in the auditor's remit. As you know, with the fee proposals, the major emphasis there is to try and persuade the client to disclose it, because we think that is the appropriate way for it to be done. And if you like, the auditor is only disclosing it as a sort of last resort, and therefore it was appropriate to give some flexibility as to how. Here we're saying it should be very clear that the auditor, if you like, they're reporting almost in how they have conducted the audit and what independence requirements have been applied to them. So it is just a statement of fact, but it's all to do with the auditor, not to do with the client per se.
Dawn?
Thanks, Galen. On the question A, it seems to make sense that you would also consider what the previous accountant had done and how they had treated the entity. So there would be some consideration if they were of the view that it was a PI, you would likewise have to consider that or defend why you didn't think so. And on point B, it's my view that option 2 makes the most sense, that we should be considering the post-implementation review and what comes out of that.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Christian Oath would also like to make a comment. He's just starting with the technology.
Thank you. Michael, quick question from my side regarding mentioning whether the PI has been treated as a PI. If I understand that correctly, if we audit a non-PI and would, I would say, gold plate this being audited as a PI, doesn't this have also kind of a downside that we come into a situation that non-PIs are trying to get this gold plate of being audited as a PI? Or is that all even intended?
It's certainly a possibility, and one of the things which is alluded to in the factors that a firm should take into account in determining whether to treat something as a PI, and which we will expand on in the guidance material, is the governance around that entity. Because I do think if you look at certainly within the IAASB code and to a greater extent in the IAASB code, a lot of the provisions that are built in for pies are concerned with communication with those charged with governance, which has the inbuilt presumption that you've got somebody sensible on the other side of the table to have that conversation with. So we would point firms away from treating something as a pie that did not merit being treated as a pie, if I can put it like that.
If I may, sorry for not being able to raise the hand, but this would be very interesting, especially with respect to those non-pies that are growing rapidly and are trying to go public or become a pie without having the correct structure in place. So I think this is, of course, something very interesting. So thank you for the comment.
Okay. Yeah, and certainly we would see it as a mechanism by which the auditor could encourage, if you like, appropriate governance, because the response would be, well, if you want to be treated as a pie, then start acting like one, and then we'll think about treating you as one.
Michael, I don't see any other remarks here. Other hands raised.
Okay, just very quickly then on other matters, there were three things I wanted to go through very quickly. One's on related entity, one's on effective date, and then just cover off next steps. Related entity, there is only one place where, in effect, we use the term listed entity audit client in terms of separating it out from pies, which is in R400.20, which is where we define the audit client within the IAASB code to include upstream and sister entities if you are a listed entity, but we don't do it for anything else. When the task force looked at this, given that we are seriously considering getting rid of the term listed entity from the revised definition, that does leave us a problem as to what we do here. When we looked at it, we decided that philosophically, there was no good philosophical reason for not extending the definition audit client, which applies to listed entities, to all public interest entities. However, there are potentially practical and pragmatic reasons why that would be difficult. And if you look at the consideration that was given to this question when this definition was first arrived at some years ago, it seemed much more to do with the structure that surrounded certain entities rather than actually the nature of the entity itself. So in other words, the position of sovereign wealth funds, the issue of private equity complexes, et cetera, do add to the complexities if you start extending the definition. And therefore, if you like, as I say, it's more to do with the structure that surrounds the pie rather than the nature of the pie itself, i.e. whether it's listed or whether it's caught by one of the other categories. It's just that if it is listed, it is far less likely, not totally impossible. Temasek, which is the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, does have controlling interests in a number of listed entities, but it is less likely that they will, that the listed entities will fall foul of that particular complexity. So, having decided that was the issue, we've agreed with the board that we as a task force will consider thinking about what the issues are, but we are rapidly coming to the conclusion we are not going to try and solve it through this project. In other words, there's going to have to be a subsequent project, if it's determined appropriate, to look at the whole context of differing structures and how that relates to the definition of audit client. So one solution to allow finalization of the PI project, as we've said here, is we will replace listed entity in 420 with category A in 414. So in other words, that is how we will seek to overcome the thing with the least disruption in a practical sense as to what that actually means on the ground. But ultimately, it's going to require a further project to look at the whole definition of what should be included in related entities for different categories of client. Sorry. Go back one. Hang on. Apologies, losing control of this. So, any views on that in terms of our practical solution and park the problem, if I can put it like that?
Michael, I don't see any hands.
I should have said at the outset of this presentation, I do take silence as acquiescence.
I think you're good. I don't see any.
Okay. Timelines, obviously, we are looking at when we might look at the effective date. There's obviously implications for NAS and fees. I have to say my view has always been that to some extent, the NAS and the fees projects were about defining what it made sense to apply to entities of public interest. Whether you capture everything that's required to be of public interest is what this project is all about. You don't need to necessarily make the effective dates coterminous. Clearly, if you apply it to the current categories of pies, you are likely, given the direction of travel that we've gone in, to have a broader category that it then gets applied to later. It's unlikely to be a narrower category, except potentially in one or two very limited circumstances. So we are looking at still quite a long effective date, which may go beyond the NAS and fees effective dates, but that is still a discussion that the IAASB Planning Committee and Board are having. Next steps in October, as I say, we've continued with the PAO questionnaire. We've also put something out to the Forum of Firms, and we'll be discussing matters with them. We've got obviously a PI session with the IAASB in November. We're meeting the IFAC SNPAG, and lastly, we have the December IASB meeting when hopefully we will be in a position to approve an exposure draft. That's it from me. Right.
Well, thank you, Michael. I don't see any final comments from the representatives. So with that, I'm going to leave it to Jim Dawkin for any final remarks that you might have.
Galen, can we just ask Shigeo?
Oh, I thought, yeah, I'm sorry. I thought Jim was going to invite Shigeo to weigh in. Shigeo, if you would please do that. Floor is yours, Shigeo. You're still on mute, though.
Sorry. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to be observing this joint CAG meeting. And I thank the task force for sort of their efforts in achieving a very strong coordination between the two boards. And I'm also happy to be observing a good discussion that took place during this session. And I can support the approach the task force is proposing. I think one of the difficulties is striking a balance between the global definition and the local application. And I think it's a big challenge. Ideally, local bodies should be in a position to be able to refine the list, but not too much. Similarly, firms should be given the responsibility of adding flexibility to the local approach, but again, not too much. I think in both cases, good judgments are very important in this respect. And in that sense, I think it is our view that the clarity in the provisions and transparency will be essential safeguards against sort of inappropriate exercise of the judgments. So I think on transparency, I understand that you'll be having discussions with IAASB, but I think these are very important points. And as a final comment, as I said, I was happy to observe this meeting, which had good discussion. It was well organized and effectively chaired. And I think various points of view were raised. So I just want to say that the PIV really appreciates this opportunity at the CAG meeting to listen to the various views from the multi-stakeholders. I think it is very important process in the standard setting process. So again, I am very happy and thank you very much.
Thank you, Shigeo. Yeah. Okay, Jim.
I'd also like to thank Mike Ashley for his contributions. And his time. I think this is a very important joint issue for the IASBA as well as the IAASB CAGs. And so I appreciate the effort. Thank you, Shigeo. Shigo, for your comments from a PIOB perspective. And I'm going to go back to Stavros to see if he has any final thoughts from a board perspective. Stavros? Well, there may be some.
You unmute Stavros.
Can you hear me now? I apologize.
Yes, we hear.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you,
yes.
Jim. And thank you, Mike, for a very good presentation. And thank you all for your good comments, including our PIOB observer. As you know, we have been quite conscious of the difficulties of this project from the very beginning. And the difficulties of the project basically have to do with global applicability, with how and whether you can make a definition of pi that's going to, on one hand, push the concept forward, and on the other hand, be applicable in a great variety of jurisdictions with a great variety of their own approaches and definitions. The discussion today gives me confidence that we are getting there. And I really appreciate the fact that the members of the CAG have understood the challenge that we're facing and have sympathized and assisted in the work we're trying to do. So thank you all very much for that. As Mike said, we're looking forward to hopefully put out an exposure draft in December. I personally think we are on a good path. And of course, lastly, the coordination with the IAASB is the other valuable leg of this project, that in effect, we're going on an enterprise that's going to hopefully finish with a common definition. So I want to thank our IAASB colleagues for all the attention they're giving to this. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you, Stavros. And just a few additional announcements I did want to cover. One is there is going to be an IAASB CAG call prior to the beginning of December, and that focus is going to be on LCEs and to less complex entities. I think that is one where there's been a lot of interest on behalf of the IAASB CAG. So look in your email for information on that. And also, I wanted to cover some of the tentative dates that we have coming up for future CAG meetings. The first one will be on March 8th through the 10th. And the IASBA CAG portion will be on March the 8th. That's tentatively, they have scheduled, I believe, for New York, depending on the pandemic situation. And then September 7th through the 8th, with the IASBA CAG being on September the 7th. I'm sorry, September 7th through the 9th. So again, back to the March and September timeframes as we typically have. And with this, I'd like to close the joint session and appreciate everyone's time and attentions. I think these are very important issues to talk about jointly amongst the CAGs. We will continue at 9:45, so we will have a 15-minute break, and this will be for the IASBA session on engagement teams relative to group audits. So stay tuned here to 9:45 if you're a member of the IASBA CAG. And with that, I wish everyone a good day or good afternoon if you're signing off. We will be back in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim.
I see that it's 7:45. I don't know if we have most people back on yet.
Yeah, it's a little hard to tell, but I think we should probably make a start, I think.
Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and do that? So this, I'd like to continue to welcome our participants in the final day 3 of the IASBA CAG meeting. So it'll be our final session and a virtual meeting, as you all know, and welcome everyone for their participation. And I think these meetings have gone fairly well, given the circumstances. So I'd also like to continue to welcome Shigeo Kashiwagi, who is observing on behalf of the PIOB, and of course, Dr. Stavros Stamadakis, the ISBA chair. We should have online here Richard Fleck, the ISBA deputy chair, and also Sylvie Sourier. She's an ex-ISBA member, and she is the task force chair of the engagement team and group audit project. And she will present the task force proposals on the implication of the change of the definition of engagement team that's in ISA 220 and the implications on how to enhance and clarify the independence provisions applicable in a group audit context. And so with that, Sylvie, I'll turn the time to you.
Thank you very much. I think Carla is perfect. Is starting the screen sharing. Okay, well, and I am very pleased to do that presentation for the CAG. We met briefly last time at the last meeting, and we presented the project at the time. But here we will have the opportunity, to present the 6 months work of the task force. Perhaps I will go immediately to the agenda and explain the objective of the session. So that project, if you remember correctly, is really coming from a full coordination with IAASB, and in particular, coordination in relation to 2 ISAs, ISA 220, which has been approved a couple of weeks ago and relates to the definition of an engagement team with some revisions. And ISA 600 on group audits. The project is being exposed. I mean, there is an exposure draft right now, and IAASB will receive some of the comments in a few weeks. So you see that we are coordinated and working based on 2 projects, but both have a pretty different timelines, even if the 2 are really correlated and linked. And for us, it's very important that we ensure the alignment with both ISA 220 and 600. And of course, the purpose of the session is to give you some feedback about our approach, not only the task force, but also the board, to address the issues for that project. So let's move on to the next slide. So you see, we refer to 2 ISAs, meaning that there are a number of key matters that I would like to present to you as part of that session. The first part really relates to ISA 220, and that's the first half of our project. It's about considering that the code is using correctly the extended or the prior definition of ISA 220 and using the concept of the engagement team. To the extent that ISA 220 is changing, we have to look at what are the consequences for the code. So we will look at I would say the definition, more about the vocabulary issues and how we will include those changes in the code. But beyond just the terminology, what the terminology or the new definition is carrying may have some consequences on the individuals that are members of that engagement team, and in particular in reference to their independence. So we will look more closely at the consequence for those individuals and in the context of a group audit. In relation to ISA 600, to the extent that ISA 600 refers to component auditors that could be outside the firm or the network firm, we will look at the preliminary thinking on independence for the firms that are outside the network and acting as component auditor in the context of a group audit. So on those three first points, the task force, having received the feedback and input from the board and done some work, some elements are ready to present to you. But it is also important to explain to you what are some matters that the task force has not yet been able to explore entirely, and that are still left to be explored before we move to an exposure draft. And of course, we will explain what is our timeline. So let's move on to the first topic. So let me give you first a little bit of background on what we have done, the task force and the board. We have been working until, I would say, the last months, based on all the definition and draft material that was provided to us and discussed and exchanged with the ISA 220 task force. When ISA 220 was finally approved a couple of weeks ago, they have clarified a number of elements in their definition, and there were some slight changes in the definition that were not yet anticipated by the task force, because we had worked on some drafts that were not final. So we are at a point where I would say we have, with the task force and the board, looked, I would almost at 80–90% of the issues related to those definitions, but because the IAASB approved a final text almost the same day as we were doing our final presentation for the board, we know already that there are a number of matters that we have not fully explored, and we will tell you which one. So first, let's work first on what we had already anticipated and been able to fully explore. We are putting on that slide, side by side, the definition that we have in the extant code and the new definition that will be from the now approved ISA 220. So you will see that in the extant code, we have one definition of engagement team, and that definition applies for audit, reviews, and assurance engagements. So it's the engagement team in general, and for us, it applies to all those type of engagements. ISA 220 has been focused only on the definition of engagement team in the context of an audit. So for us, the definition of audit engagement team is modified as the result of ISA 220. But when we are talking about review engagement or assurance engagement, the engagement team is still what we used to have in the definition before. So that's one of the key changes. The other key change, so that applies only to the audit, is who are the individuals who are now members of the audit engagement team. The focus of ISA 220 is really on those individuals who are performing audit procedures on the engagement, I would say almost regardless where they are located or employed. In our extant code, the individuals in the engagement team working on an audit are the individuals from a firm or a network firm. But you will see that in the ISA 220, if we look at the application material A17, it may also include some other individuals who are performing audit procedures. So of course, those from the firm and the network firm, but they could include individuals from outside the network or from some service providers. And the term service providers is defined in ISQ M1. So for us, we have some differences here that we have identified and that are important for us to highlight, so we can make sure that when we refer to some terminology in the code, we apply the right terminology in the right context. And plus, the work of the task force and the board has been to determine what should be those independence requirements applicable to the individuals that are now considered members of the engagement team in the context of an audit. So those are really the key elements that we need to manage. So let's move to the next slide. So the first element is really the terminology, as I was explaining. Since we have one single definition in the code that is used for audit, reviews, and assurance, but now we are not talking about exactly the same individuals when we're talking under the ISAs, when we are talking about audit, review, and assurance. So the first proposal from the task force that is, I would say, supported by the board, is that we will need to split our definition in 3 definitions. So not only one single definition for engagement team, but 3 definitions for audit engagement team, review engagement team, and assurance engagement team. And we will have to make sure, of course, that the right definition is used in the right context in the code. The ISA 220 definition, which is engagement team in the context of an audit, will be exactly the same for our definition of audit engagement team. It is what is changed in the ISA and will be fully reflected. However, we don't want to lose the definition that we have for reviews and assurance engagements, because we still need to refer to the engagement team working on those engagements. So the fact that we are creating 2 additional definitions, those 2 definitions will just be consistent with what we have in the code today. Perhaps, you know, in the future, IAASB will reword the definition of engagement team for assurance, and in this case, it will be easier for us at the IASBA also to reflect and adjust changes as needed. So clearly, one definition in ISA 220 for audits. As a consequence, we will need 3 definitions in the code, depending on the type of engagements, because those engagements, you know, will have different consequences, in particular in relation to independence. So that's the first level. The second level, besides the alignment of the defined term, and we will move to the next slide. Okay. Actually, this slide is the proposed definition that we are creating. You will see that in the middle, our definition for audit engagement team is the same definition as what we have in ISA 220. However, we also lifted in our definition some of the application material that are in ISA 220. So it will be more comprehensive for the users. The other assurance engagement team and review engagement team are mostly the same of what we have today, and they are taking the same individuals as we have today. Let's move to the next one. There are other definitions that are leveraging the concept of engagement team. In the code, we, in the independent section, today, we refer to engagement team, and then we refer to the audit team or the assurance team. Because when we are determining the individuals for which some independence requirements are applicable, we focus on the members of the engagement team and also some additional individuals with the capacity to influence the outcome of the engagement. So if to the extent that we are creating a definition for audit engagement team and for assurance engagement team, we need to modify slightly our definition of audit team and our definition of assurance team. So it's more like a consequence of the split or the change that I was just explaining to you. So for that, we believe, and with the support of the board, that we will be able to clearly determine which individuals will be subject to which requirement in the various sections of the code with the proper alignment of definition. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, the third one is also the definition of review team, another consequence of the definitions, small changes. We can move to the next one. To facilitate the review of the board and to see how those changes of definition will operate in the code, the task force created what we call a straw man, and looking at the various application or terminology that we need to use in existing provision of the code, to make sure that we are now using the right terminology in the right paragraph and in the right context. And for instance, very logical, when we're talking about part 4A, which relates to the independence in the context of audit engagement, we are now referring to audit engagement team, newly defined. Of course, when we are in part 4B, related to assurance engagement, we now refer to assurance engagement team or assurance team as relevant. We identified in the code the term engagement team that was not used in the context of assurance or audit or reviews. And we have only one instance, actually, so to avoid confusion, we are just changing that to the term team. I believe that the strawman was attached to your material, so you can see, how that will be operating in the code with those changes. And we did some markup with colors to facilitate the review. Let's move on. I was presenting to you earlier the final definition from the ISA 220, and you see that it refers to the concept of service provider, which is a defined term in ISQM1. It is a pretty broad definition. And for us, it is something that the task force has not fully explored to see whether there is any risk for conclusion or any need for clarification. Because I would say that in the prior draft that the task force had been working with, the wording was slightly different, and we were not really focusing on service provider. Today, we have clarity that IAASB considers that a component auditor could be a service provider, or is a service provider, sorry, but that service provider could also be some other type of categories of resource providers. And the task force needs to do some work to see in which circumstances we have to clarify what is a service provider within the context of the code. So for us, it's still an open question, but I wanted to highlight that to us because it is something that we have not yet explored, but we know that we need to explore since now, as ISQM1 is approved, ISA 220 is approved with the reference to service providers. Okay, let's move on to, okay, so I am just, we are just showing here the example of what are the resources that are, that could come from a service provider. You see that ISQM1 presents 4 bullet points. And for us, it's the third bullet point, a service provider, that we understand is included potentially in the definition of audit engagement team. The first bullet points are for us more individuals that are in the audit team. They are not members of the audit engagement team. Of course, when we're talking about commercial IT application, we're not speaking of individuals. So with those definitions and those examples, the task force is considering whether we need to provide further clarification or perhaps at some point FAQ to avoid any risk of confusion. So at that point, we have identified work to do, but we have not yet fully explored. Let's move to the next one. There were some questions and comments that were pending when we were working with the board last June. And we had a number of questions about the fact that in the definition of engagement teams in the code and in ISA 220, external experts are excluded from the definition. And there was also an open question about what is exactly service provider. The new definition in ISA 220 was providing a response to those questions, confirming that the external expert that is not performing audit procedures, but merely doing some consultation on the matters that are relevant to the audit, they are still excluded from the audit engagement team. And as I say, on the question related to the concept of service provider, we have now some more clarity from ISQM1, but we have not yet fully addressed all the consequences and the issues. But those were some pending questions for which we have more clarity today. So let's move on. So at that point, I think I will stop here. Take any question or comment you may have on the fact that we are proposing to split the definition for the purpose of the code and to be more accurate and specific to make sure that there is no confusion as to which individual we are talking about in various parts of the code, and clarify, of course, you know, for that purpose, which will be the independence requirement applicable to each category. So here I will pause, Galen, and open for questions.
Thank you, Sylvie. And so if the representatives have any reaction or view on what they just heard, if you could please raise your hand. Naomi?
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. So I will not go into the technical details of your presentation. Sylvie, thank you for all the background. I just wanted to mention actually the importance of the coordination between both boards. And this was re-emphasized by the IAASB chair earlier. And I think it's telling here that even if we take care of it, it's not always as easy because you are all pressed by time. And here I see that there are some unintended consequences maybe that you have now to deal with at IESBA, given this, the IAASB move. So it raises some, I think, some questions or some thoughts on how to best coordinate, because you are pushing a lot around that already, but it's not always 100%. So it's difficult, I find.
Galen, may I respond now, or do we take more questions?
However you'd like to. We could take a couple. We have a couple more hands up. Mangwai.
Okay.
Oh,
Mang?
thanks, Galen. Thanks, Galen. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for Sylvia's presentation. I appreciate the work has been done by the task force. Generally, I support the way to create 3 new terms to align the definition of engagement team. Here, I would like to express my one comment. As it was mentioned by Sylvia and also in the agenda paper, why external experts would be excluded from having to comply with independence requirement. In my opinion, it is really a good question and a thought-provoking question. I would like to encourage the board to continue to discuss it. That's all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mang. Takeshi? Takashi?
You're on mute, Takashi.
Yeah. Takeshi, have you
hear me?
There you go. There you are.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for the presentation, Sylvia, and I am supportive for the direction of the task force to align the definition with ISO 220. But when I look through the agenda item 2, a Strawman draft, I can find a very similar term a lot of time. For example, audit team and audit engagement team, and also the assurance team and the assurance engagement teams. And after I heard your presentation, I understand that each terminology definition is reasonable, and this Strawman draft is very also reasonable. But for not native speakers, the term of audit team and audit engagement team, maybe they might have a translation issue in the future. And also, at first time I read this agenda item 2, I'm become a little confused. Very similar terminology we can find a lot of time. So I understand your explanation that this project is very early stage, and so it would be appreciated to, how do you say, unify the definition in the future consideration. For example, change the audit team and audit engagement team to the one word, if possible. And I have one very specific point comment on the definition. For example, definition assurance engagement team or assurance team or review team or review engaged team. This definition does not include it in those who perform assurance procedure or review procedure from the firm that is from outside of the network. So at this stage, but for example, in Japan, for the listed entities, for the financial statement is mandate for the audit, actually, and also the quarterly financial statement, the review assurance is mandate for the listed entity. In addition to the financial statement, the internal control for the financial reporting, like US SOX, Japanese SOX is mandate for the assurance from the auditor. In such cases, the audit team or the review team and assurance for the SOX team, usually same members. Assurance SOX engagement team usually included outside people from outside the network. So into consideration this situation, the assurance team engagement definition and also assurance review engagement team definition maybe should include it in the outside of the people from the outside the network, same as audit engagement team. So again, this project is very early stage, so I would like to task force to take the consideration of this point in the future consideration. Thank you.
Sylvie, would you like to respond to both of those comments, and then we have Megan Zeitzman, and then I would like to ask a couple questions.
Okay, I will answer those three questions. Naomi, I don't think we can talk about unintended consequences that were not anticipated. Actually, you know, I think the task force, the ISA 220 task force, and the way the board has made some changes is providing some responses to some of the questions that our IASB task force had in the past. I mean, we raised a number of comments and feedback to the ISA 220 task force when we were working together. And I would say that the final determination by IAASB is providing some answers to those open questions. So now we know where we are going, and we have some clarity. The unintended consequences for us in the drafting to make sure that we really explore all the possibility of interpretation and consequence for the terms that are being used. So, and that we avoid any risk of confusion. But I don't think that we can say that the determination from IAASB is creating some new challenges or new consequences for us. We are working based on what they are giving to us. Now we have clarity, and now we can do some more meaningful work. So I think the coordination is not, I mean, we've been working very closely with Imran's team and ISA 220 and exchanging regularly. About the external experts, it's interesting that point because a number actually even of board members of the IASBA are challenging. You know, why are those external experts excluded from the definition and therefore from the independence requirement? So the first thing I can answer is that that topic about excluding or including external expert has been the subject of lengthy discussion between in the past when we updated or changed the definition the last time with some exclusion on engagement team. And there was a lot of work that was done already at the time to explain why those external experts would not be subject to independence. It's also important to notice that there is a specific ISA, which is ISA 620, which is about the use of external experts in the context of an audit. And similarly, that there is an ISA about the use of internal audit work also in the context of an audit. So there is the possibility, and there is a full ISA that is existing, that it is possible to use the work of certain categories of people, internal auditors, external experts, for which we know that there is no independence requirements, but the audit engagement team still needs to evaluate their objectivity and to which point they can use that work and rely on that type of work. So they are excluded from the independence requirements, but there are some dedicated ISAs for those individuals that are excluded. And the view is that we are not talking about experts, for instance, in auditing who are doing audit procedures. We're talking about experts like, for instance, lawyers that might provide specific legal opinions, or some valuation experts, etc., that are not performing audit procedures, but mostly providing some consultation. And ISA 220 is very clear about that as well, plus ISA 620. Takeshi, on your comments, the current code is already having two definitions. We have a definition, three actually. We have already a definition of engagement team, which are really the individuals doing the procedures, either on audit or assurance engagement. And we have another definition of audit team or assurance team. And we are bringing in that definition some additional individuals, for instance, partners in the same, partners who can, I would say more like the chain of command of the partner, the lead audit partner, or the quality review partners, for instance. So those people are clearly not performing audit procedures, but we are bringing in the code with some dedicated independence requirements. So we have already that split. And you were talking about the translation in Japanese, but today, since those two terms are existing, engagement team and audit team, it is already translated in Japanese, something for assurance team. So since it is already in existence, that might be feasible, you know, to for practitioners not to have the confusion, because we cannot bring them under one word, because we are not talking about the same category of people when using those two definitions. I hear also your point about bringing some people that are outside the firm or the network when we're talking about reviews or other assurance engagements. As of today, since the code is really using the terminology from the IAASB, we cannot create different or diverging definition or rules to the extent that they are referring to a certain team. We can only apply the independence requirement to the people that are under the IAASB considered to be member of the team. In the situation that you mentioned, if you say that, for instance, you have the same members who are doing some audit work, review work, or also working on some assurance engagement, for us, those individuals, to the extent that they are members of the audit engagement team, they will be subject to the more demanding independence requirements. So that one will be applicable, even if they do reviews and internal controls. Galen, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you, Sylvie. Megan, did you had something you wanted to bring up? And then Natasha Landa-Mills.
Thanks, Galen, and thanks everybody, and thanks Sylvie for the presentation and the explanation. I actually had a couple of points, and actually some of them I think you've just touched on as you responded to others' comments. So I think it makes sense to amend the code, and I think the idea of having the three different definitions for audit, assurance, and review, and kind of making them all aligned. That makes sense to me, and I think the direction of travel looks good there. And then I think I was going to ask a question about the coordination with the IAASB, because I'd had the opportunity to serve as an observer to the ISQM1 task force, and at least from my perspective on that, it looked like there had been very close coordination, not only with ISA 220, but also with ISQM1 and ISQM2 between the IAASB task forces and the IESBA along the way. So I was a little surprised to hear about unintended consequences, and now this was a problem. But I think what you just clarified was really helpful. I think there was a lot of opportunity for input from the IESBA to be taken into account by the IAASB task forces, and I certainly saw firsthand that happening. So I think your additional comments there were helpful clarification. And totally understand there's probably some last minute things that need to just be considered, but I think it is important for the concepts to be aligned and make sure that these things work together. And then I think the last point that I just wanted to raise was, I think actually it's a similar point to what Takeshi raised and what you've just addressed, the fact that there is already this difference between engagement team and audit team. I would say even as a native English speaking person, that's confusing. And now when I look at some of the markup in, I think is an agenda item G2, where now it talks just about teams. So it's not even been an engagement team, it just says team. I think that's even more confusing as to what team has been spoken about. So notwithstanding that this is something that, as you've just explained, is in the code today, maybe this is an opportunity to figure out if there's actually the ability to use maybe a different or broader term for the broader group, which I think is the concept of an audit team today, that includes, like you pointed out, the folks that sit in the chain of command or the engagement quality reviewer or others. That seems like it's obviously a broader group of individuals, and maybe there's just some opportunity to provide some additional clarity as this work progresses. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan.
Natasha, do you want to weigh in now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, and also thank you for that presentation. A really simple comment, I hope, from an investor perspective, Sylvia. Basically, I think what I would say is that the independence requirement should really cover all those that can influence audit or assurance process. So I'd include, the external experts, component auditors, etc. Otherwise, really, there's a risk to the objectivity of the result. And I think to echo a comment earlier, I think it would be better and frankly easier, less confusing, to have a simple and uniform definition across, which is probably broader in scope, or taking the broader approach in terms of scope. I think, again, just focusing on what we're trying to achieve here, which is getting the right outcome rather than sort of simply following procedures in a sort of tick box way. And I think independence throughout that supply chain is really, really important. Thank you.
Sylvie, would you like to respond to Natasha and Megan?
Well, actually, on Megan, I really, I'm taking all the comments. I'm taking particularly the comments on thinking about perhaps another terminology, because that could be an opportunity to have a more different terminology, and I will bring that to the task force. See, we can be creative here. I agree that even in the past, the fact that we use audit team and engagement team could create confusion. I think professionals have now, or auditors, they are used to those terminology, but we know that it could be confusing. So we can look at if we can find something convenient.
Sylvia, I wanted to, were you going to address Natasha's comment? Or?
Yes, I was.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Actually, what we're doing, Natasha, when the fact that we create that more broader definition in the code, has exactly that purpose. It is to say that it's not only the people who are the individuals doing the audit procedures, who are we calling now audit engagement team, that are subject to independence requirements at a minimum, what we call personal independence requirements. But the code actually is also putting some requirement and prohibition for a broader group of people, which is why we have created that second definition. And the first component of that second definition is the definition now from ISA 220, but we are bringing also more individuals. For instance, we are saying that those other individuals, perhaps we can go back just to show it on Carla definition of audit team. Because just if you look at the structure of the definition, yes, you see, if you look at the definition of audit team, little a is the ISA 220 definition. It's one group of individuals that are doing the audit procedures. But what the code is doing is say that personal independence requirements are not only for those doing the audit engagement procedures, but also some others. So the broader group, and we have the I, 2I, 3I, etc. That are included. So that's exactly how the code is doing. We are bringing in more individuals with independence requirement for the when you have an audit, and actually we have that also for assurance team. So we supplement the definition of ISA 220, which is A, with some other individuals also that are subject to independence requirement. Plus, depending on some circumstances, actually, the code will also, for a certain scenario, bring in some additional individuals. They are not in the definition, but for instance, the partners in the same office as the audit partner, they will have also dedicated independence requirements. So that's the way the code is working today. So that's to answer your questions. Galen,
Yeah, Sylvia, I had a couple things that I wanted to bring up, if you don't mind. And I appreciate the work that's been done by the task force, and I agree with the notion of aligning and really to some extent expanding and clarifying who is in and who is out. I would just hope that the task force wouldn't want to, imply that there's different levels of independence. I think when we talk about independence, we're talking about independence from the client, and regardless of the service that's being provided, that independence should come through. And in that respect, I did have a question about review engagements and audit engagements in the independence. Would there ever really be much of a difference between audit independence and review independence? So that's really my first query of you. And then the second one, I saw in one of the earlier slides where it talked about internal audit, and that's always come up as a question. And I saw where they're lined out. So but at the same time, I think it's really important to clarify what internal audit is or is not as far as the team is concerned. Whether it's stricken out or not, at some point, I think it needs to be clarified, maybe in the application guidance or elsewhere. And then on the external experts, I think the way that the task force has approached that is completely logical. There's experts within a company that's being audited that the external auditor relies on, and they look at objectivity and competency and evaluate those. And I think externally, the same sort of measure should be applied, and that independence isn't necessarily one of those things that's required internally. So why should it be required externally? Of course, you'd want those people to be as independent as possible, but it's not as possible. Either you're independent or you're not independent. So that's really the three questions that I had.
Actually, on review and audit, I think we will work further with the IAASB. As I said, right now, we really depend on their definition. We are not creating new definition. We don't want to that would be also a miscoordination to create a definition that could also have some consequences for the IAASB. So we need to make sure that we are fully aligned. So if they have some definition for engagement team in relation to review, I mean, as of today, it's not the same as the definition for audits. So we need to make sure that we are not supplementing their work. On internal audit, we're talking about internal auditors. So internal auditors, they are necessarily from the client, the entity being audited. And we cannot apply the same independence requirement because, for instance, if you are an external auditor, if you are a member of the audit engagement team, there is one principle, which is you cannot be employed also by the entity that you are auditing. So and we know that there are certain jurisdictions where there is a possibility to use some of the internal auditors to help with audit procedures. So we cannot apply the same level of requirements because it would be totally impossible. You cannot expect an internal auditor not to be paid, remunerated by their employer, for instance. So this is why that category of people is excluded from the engagement team, from the external auditor, because it is impossible to expect them to have the same level of independence since they are employed by the entity. So it's something that was, as I say, explored, and it is also the subject of a separate ISA. And an external expert, it's about the same thing. I think ISQ, is it ISQ M1? I mean, the way external experts now are defined, ISA 220, making a distinction between those who are providing consultation versus those who are working on the audit will be also helpful. And we will, again, it's something that we obtain clarification more recently. And we will see whether we need to put more application material to make a distinction between the external expert that might be in or might be out, depending on what type of work they are doing.
Thank you, Sylvia. I don't see any other hands if you wanted to go forward.
Okay, so let's move on to the next. Okay, so the first part was about to say, you know, we have a terminology issue and the determination of a group. Now that the group is clear, we need to understand what are the independence requirements which are applicable to those individuals, and that also applicable to the employing organization of those individuals if those individuals are outside the network. That's the next step. And for that, we coordinate with the task force on ISA 600 because we're talking about in the context of group audits and the use of component auditors. And in particular, we are focusing on the situation where the component auditors are from outside the network. Because today, the way the code is written, it is written from the perspective of firm and network firm, and not from the perspective of outside component auditors. It is also today written in the considering more like a standalone audit and not a group audit. So the coordination work with ISA 600 is intended to clarify how we would, I mean, what is, I would say, missing in the code, and or in addition to the alignment. So the definition of component auditor is in the revised proposed ISA 600 is being modified also in the draft that in the exposure draft that we have seen. And there are a number of elements that are creating some important changes for us that we need to clarify, which is first reference to engagement team, and also a clarification of two subgroups, what they call the group engagement team, which is more, I would say, the core team from doing the group audit at top entity level, and what they call component auditors, that are the individuals who are working in components. And the other very important element is the fact how a component is being determined. Because a component is now, is not anymore aligned to, I would say, legal structure. The component is determined more by the group engagement team based on how to plan and perform the audit. So a component could be a combination of entities or a combination of sub levels of multiple entities. For instance, if you look at application material in A5, which is here in the slide, they give an example of a group, for instance, with 15 legal entities. But those 15 legal entities could be combined only in 3 components. And actually, they could be parts of one legal entity that is split in component 1 and component B. So it's creating some complexities for us in the IASBA, because when we are talking about what is the independence of a component auditor with respect to a component, of course, we need to understand what is that component, what it is made of, and in this case, which entities we are talking about and how far do we go. So those are really the issues that the task force is trying to address to determine independence requirements in the context of a group audit. So let's move on to the next slide. So actually, we are looking at the consequence of those changes in 600 plus to 20. And we were looking at independence in relation to the independence of individuals, and also independence in relation to the independence of the firms who are component auditors, because we need to when the individual are confirming the independence, they need to know what is their framework and from which entities they are independent. And similarly, if a firm as a component auditor is confirming independence in the context of a group audit, we need also to understand what is their framework for independence and which are the entities they are expected to be independent from. So if I look at the individuals, as the task force has been exploring a number of governing principles that will be applying in the context of a group audit. At that point, we were only talking about the key principles with the board. We have not started to do any drafting so far, because we wanted to be clear in the direction and on the what would be the expectation when we will be starting to do some drafting. So the view of the task force and of the board is that when we're talking about an individual who is a member of the audit engagement team, there should be no difference for the independence requirement, whether that individual, those audit procedure is employed by the firm and doing some audit procedures at the group top entity level, or employed by a network and doing procedures at a component, or employed by outside the firm and the network, and also doing audit procedures at, let's say, the same component, for instance. So for us, regardless of where those individuals are located or employed, to the extent that they are performing audit procedures for the purpose of a group audit, we expect that they would be having the same independence requirements. So that's the first principle. The second element is the consequence of having those components redefined as I just showed you in the ISA 600. Today, the code, when we're talking about personal independence or independence in general, the code uses the concept, what were presented to you in the PI definition earlier. We use the concept of the entity under audit and its related entities. And in the code, the audit engagement team, so those individuals performing the audit procedures, are expected to be independent of the entity that they are auditing, and also the related entities of that entity under audit. What we understand from the new definition of what is a component, since this is not linked anymore to the legal structure, there could be a possibility that a component could include entities or parts of entities that are not related entities as defined by the code. So our view is that to the extent that a component is scoping in more entities than what we define being related entities, independence would also be required there. So it adds, I would say, in the scope of independence, all the components that are scoping under ISA 600. So in most situations that will be similar to the situation that we have today, but they could be, depending on the complexity and the structure of a group audit, it could be also including some additional entities. So that's what we have. And that's particularly true in relation to non-listed audit clients. Because today, when we look at the independence requirement for listed entities, it's pretty comprehensive. You know, it captures a number of related entities, almost all the related entities. When we're talking about non-listed entities under audits, it is much more limited in its scope. But since we are now aligning to the structure of the group audits, we believe that any entity that is subject to capture under the group audit, there is some expectation that there will be some independence requirement for the individuals working on those audits. So that the second element really of our the principles that we are putting together and how independence would apply to that entire group of engagement team, which is here presented in this chart. I believe that here, if I move to the next slide, Carla, there is Carla. Oh,
yep, it's.
I think you're going to ask for questions here.
Yeah, I think the next one is the question. I just want to make sure. Carla, I don't. My screen is frozen, so I don't see. I don't see the slide that you have. The next one is a question. Is it correct?
It is the question page.
Yeah. So I am posing here because it's the two principles that we are putting forward for independence of audit engagement team members.
So we'll call for comments here, but if we could go back to slide 16. So yeah. On that slide, Sylvie, why are we, when we say group audit client listed, why aren't we framing that in the context of a PI, or is that something to be addressed later on?
Actually, you know, this is what Michael presented. Today, You remember he presented that slide on related entities?
Yes. Yeah.
Today when we are talking about a listed entity, so I would say a typical corporate structure, and there is the audit of a listed entity. Independence is required with respect to the entity under audit. Of course, all its controlled subsidiaries, but there is also independence requirement with respect to material investees, the controlling parent, investors with some condition of materialities, and some entities under common control. So it's a pretty broad group of entities where independence is expected. And that is the one that we have for listed today, typical group structure. When we are in a non-listed environment, the independence is usually required only for the entity under audits and its controlled subsidiaries. That's the base requirement, and other entities could be included, but it's more based on the facts and circumstances and based on the principle, the conceptual framework of the code. So that's where we need to have that distinction, because I would say that the most comprehensive level or scoping of requirement is for listed, and for non-listed, it is less comprehensive.
I don't disagree with any of that, Sylvie, but why not PI instead of listed?
But because it is the code today. The code today.
Oh, okay. Yeah, as of today.
We do not change. We do not change the code. We just clarify, since we are changing the team, what is applicable to that team.
All right. So that could potentially change after the PI project is completed.
It could. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Any other comments? I see Takeshi's hand. Takeshi, you have the floor.
Can you hear me? No.
Yes. Yes, we.
Yes, Takeshi. I can hear you.
We heard you, and then you went. Then you went mute again. Takeshi, you're still mute.
That's okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you for Sylvie this explanation. I guess this issue is very, very complex, so I'd like to express my appreciation for the task force to tackling these very complex issues. So I heard your explanation. I remind the last March CAG meeting, the other CAG members expressed that it is important to stay the code principal basis. And so I want to echo this point. And so task force should keep in mind the code should be staying principal basis. From this perspective, I think it is important for the principal. As Natasha already mentioned, the people who engage in the audit, those who perform audit procedure should be subject to the same independence requirement to apply the audit. That firm will express audit opinion. And therefore, the slide, page 16, the independence principles for individual, this table seems to me very reasonable. But maybe the next slide, maybe for the farms, this may be very more complex. So I want to the task force keep in mind that the code is should be the principal basis. Those who perform audit procedure should subject to the same requirement, and also that not only people as also but farm should be subject to the same independence requirement as a principal. But after that, as a next step, the task force should consider the practical issue, the feasible requirements, such kind of the response take into the consideration in the future project. So I want to echo again that the code should be the principal basis. So I'd like to the task force to take in this concept in the future consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Takeshi. And actually, this is really what we wanted to do. So just what we explored with the board was what should be our governing principles, and that's why we are not drafting yet. We are really getting the input to clarify what should be the principles and the direction, and based on that, we will do the drafting. So. And yes, it's something that we will, of course, pay a lot of attention to.
Sylvia, I don't see any other hands up, and I understand that you have 3 more questions that you want to get through. So
yeah,
we could move along.
I have a problem here because my screen froze. So I am using my phone to see my slides. So Carla, you need to tell me which slides you are.
You're on page 18.
Yeah.
Slide 18, Sylvie.
Yeah, and so because really it's I'm trying to know where I am. So page and I don't see it very well actually on my phone. So let's move on to the next one, which is the independence for firm in the group audit. Similarly, when we were talking about what are the independence requirements for an individual, we were considering, what should be the independence requirement for a non-network firm that is participating to the audit for a group and receiving instruction and communicated with the group with the group audit. And the view here, and I mean the way it is explicitly put in the draft ISA 600 is that component auditors, the firms, are expected to be independent of the component. And since the code is silent, I mean, doesn't say what is a component, we need to clarify what it means to be independent of a component. So the first thing is independent of the component, which are the entities that are captured. And the second one is independent of the component, what is the framework that we need to capture? Because you know that we have a different framework on independence when we're talking about public interest entities and non-public interest entities. For instance, on non-assurance services, fees, etc., we make a distinction on what are the relevant independence requirements here. So similarly, the task force has been working on the principles. And the principles that we are retained and for which we have the support of the board are the following. And I think I will ask you, Carla, to move to, and I don't have the page number, the one which is called Key Principle Independence for Firms in Group Audit. I'm sorry, I cannot see what you are saying.
It's the table, Sylvie.
The table.
Yes, we're there.
Yeah. And we need to look at a number of scenarios because we have different framework in different scenarios. For us, what is important and the principle that we're retain is what is the status or the profile of the group audit client. Because since the purpose is to issue an opinion on a group, it's the group that is important. And the first principle is it is the profile of the group that will determine the expectation of independence of the firm, the network firm, and external component auditors, if any. So our view is that if the group audit client is a public interest entity, the framework that will apply to the firm, the network firm, and the component auditors, external component auditors or third-party component auditors, it is the PI framework. Similarly, if the group is not a public interest entity, since the purpose is to have an audit opinion on a group that is not a public interest entity, the governing framework should be non-public interest entity framework. That's our principle, which means that we can split it in a number of scenarios. So for instance, we have a group audit client, which is public interest entity, and the component is a public interest entity. Well, we apply public interest entity because it's what is important at the group. But even if the component is not a public interest entity, you would expect that the component auditor will be independent of the component, but following the framework that is applicable for the group, because, as I said, the purpose is the group audit. Similarly, if the group audit client is not a public interest entity, it is not important to know, I mean, for the purpose of the of independence, only the non-public interest entity independence framework will be relevant. We know that there is some possibility, for instance, that the component auditor could also be the statutory auditor of a component that happens to be a public interest entity, and they will follow the PI requirements. But for the purpose of the group audit, they only need to be independent under the non-PI definition. For instance, if it could happen, for instance, that you have 3 auditors involved in a group audit. You have the group audit, the group firm auditor, the firm doing the group audit at group level, which could be which is a non-public interest entity, and they follow the non-public interest entity independence requirement. There could be a statutory auditor of a component that is a PI, and but they are not component auditor. So doing a standalone statutory audit of the PI, of course, they will have to follow the PI independence requirement. And there could be another component auditor just doing the audit for the purpose of the group audit, doing absolutely no opinion on the statutory audit. But since their work is expected to support the group audit of a non-PI, they only need to be independent under the non-PI framework. So that's really our first principle that we are applying here.
Sylvie, we're getting a little bit short on time.
Yeah.
We only have about 10 minutes unless we want to extend it further, which I don't think we want to do. Were there any particular I'm sorry, go ahead.
I will pause here for comments then.
Okay. Do we have any comments on this little segment? I don't see any, Sylvie.
Okay. Our view also is for the network of the component auditor. So because you have the component auditor and they have a network, we also expect that their network will follow the same independence requirement as the component auditor. That's another principle as well. I suggest we move to the draft for consideration. You know, the way we will be addressing that in the code. So Carla, if you can move to that chart with the 3
We're there now.
boxes. Yes. So now that we have our principles that are clear from the board, we will be starting to do some drafting. And we obtained direction from the board that we will be dedicated or creating a new subsection in the code that will be dedicated to group audits. So we will have in one subsection, and location is will be explored, but one subsection totally dedicated when we will be addressing all the independence requirements that are applicable to component auditors from outside the network. We thought that it was a better approach than trying to put requirements for those component auditors everywhere in the code. So it will address their independence, and there will be also some additional application material to also put on at the same location independence requirement for team members with example. So next draft that we will be presenting will be a supplemental section or additional section in the code. I will move to the further matters to be addressed. So what I am not presenting to you, because we have not yet started working on it, but you need to know that it's coming, and we will be presenting probably at the next CAG meeting. So the first elements are what you remember I was explaining earlier about the definition of service providers. We need to clarify who is in, who is out, and make sure that we do not create confusion when we are referring to service providers. But the pretty important matters are that we need to clarify are in addition to further coordination with ISA 600, because clearly we understand that they are receiving a lot of comments on their exposure draft. I think there are already like 60 letters or something like that. But there is a pretty big piece which will be how will we address breaches that could happen at a component auditor's level. It is something for which the code is silent. And the same way we are providing a framework to address ethical or independence breaches for a firm or a network firm, we will need also to supplement it with situation where there could be some breaches happening with a non-network component auditor. So that part, we know it is on our plate, but we have not yet started working on it. Perhaps we can move on to the activities that we are intending to undertake. Of course, in addition to developing now some draft, the coordination with ISA 600 is really key, and the IAASB representative, we will have to be very close to them when they will be working on the comments that they will be receiving, because you understand that any change of direction that they are making, or new consideration or new concept that they are including, will have a direct consequence for us. So we need to be able to anticipate that, and also to give them feedback when they are making some changes, to tell them whether that will also impact our work. Other expectation will be some engagement with some stakeholders. We know that we have already some stakeholders who have expressed strong interest in that project, and they have also some feedback or input that they would like to share with us. They would like also to understand our direction. IFER is one of them. And we know that the IASBA will have a number of outreach activities in this quarter. So we will also take the opportunity to further present and also take input from the various stakeholders, also professional organization in major jurisdictions. So that's the plan, including issuing a first draft for the December meeting. That's really what the task force is anticipating in the coming months. So Galen, here, I think I can stop and take any last comments from your group.
Yes, thank you, Sylvie, and for a very informative presentation. Naomi Robert has her hand raised.
Yes, thank you very much, Sylvie, for this very good presentation. I just wanted to go back to one of the comments that you made after explaining the table around the fact that it will not be only the component auditor, but its network as well. And this was not fully clear in what I reviewed. And I will not use unintended consequences here, because I heard that this was a form of word that was raising concerns. But I'm just thinking that, if component auditors would have the network of the component auditor would have to be independent with the group audit and its network. And I mean, there is a lot of independence requirements for the network here, and especially for smaller networks that may be complicated in practice. So I just would like to raise that point, and taking into account Takeshi's comment on the principles-based approach of the code, it may be quite challenging.
Naomi, to clarify, when we're talking about the firm, the way it is expected in ISA 600 and the direction is where we're saying that if you are a component auditor, you have to be independent of the component that you are, for which you are doing
yes.
audit procedures. If a firm is a component auditor, you would expect that their network, for instance, is not providing prohibited services to that component. So this is to that those type of principles that we are considering, because we know that firms are organized, often with multiple entities and as networks. So that would be problematic to have a firm doing the audits and their network firm in the same country doing the bookkeeping, for instance. So yes. Those are the principles that we are putting together.
Okay, so it will be for the same entity. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't see any other raised hands. So at this point, I'd like to invite our PIOB observer, Shigeo Kashiwagi. You have the floor. Some comment.
Okay, thank you, Galen. And I want to thank Sylvie for the presentation, and also thank the task force for their hard work. And I observed a very strong coordination efforts to align the provisions in the code and the ISAs. And I think it's I can support the overall direction of the task force work. But I have two points for further sort of consideration. One is about the exclusion of the external experts, which was mentioned by several representatives. I share the concerns raised, but at the same time, I understand that it may depend on the specific type of work this external experts are performing. So there may be a need to sort of impose independence requirements on certain types of work performed by external experts. And I also understand that this may not be a sort of area where it could be covered by this project. I hope IESBA will coordinate with the IAASB maybe in future works to cover this certain types of external experts. Another point is about the, I have some sympathy with those who raise the concerns about the confusing terminology. And I welcome that Sylvie has said that you may want to think about it at the task force. I share some concerns about for me, it's very confusing. So if you can persuade that direction, I would welcome it. So as a final sort of comment, I enjoyed sort of observing this discussion. I think it's you have very constructive dialogue with the CAG representatives, and I think it's we had a very good discussion. And also I want to thank Galen for the sort of chairing this meeting, which was very useful for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shigeo. I would invite Chairman Tabanakis if you had any sort of, if you'd like to share any final remarks.
No remarks except my thanks for very good comments that I've heard and that I've noted myself. And it is very valuable to have such discussions early on in the formation of a project as we do now, which really provides a lot of guidance, both to the task force and to all of us on the board. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Chairman. With that, we're going to go ahead and close the meeting. I'd like to thank everyone for their participation, their attention, and we'll look forward to our future meetings right around the corner. So we'll close the meeting with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.